Welcome everybody to week 7, day 3 of the Paraeducator training course. We're continuing our discussion of special education. All right. In the previous day's lecture, as well as the current one, we've been talking about inclusion. There are a number of important steps to creating a positive, inclusive classroom that serves as many students as possible. We want to communicate values and beliefs. All right, so these are some guiding values towards creating a positive and inclusive classroom. The first is that all students can learn. No matter who you are, you can learn something. We can debate what the definition of learning is, but at the end of the day, all of us human beings are able to learn. Second is that all students have value, and we need to communicate that to students. Third, our differences are a strength. You know, one of the most common examples of this is that multilingualism, the ability to speak more than one language, is something that some people see as a liability and others see as a strength. I am quite certain that it is a strength, and anyone who does any sort of research involving data regarding this phenomenon also sees it as a strength. This is just an example, and it can be used as a metaphor to describe any other similar situation. Our differences are a strength. For each person has strengths and areas of need. Okay, we like to use language that positions challenges as challenges and not as more negative things. Okay, so you're probably used to seeing things like strengths and weaknesses, right? That's what we used to say. You know, on sort of resume writing templates, resume design classes and stuff like that, I think people might still say strengths and weaknesses. Talk about your strengths, play up your strengths, play down your weaknesses. Well, in general, we don't tell students that they have weaknesses. You're weak in math. You're weak in reading. Oh, you're strong in math, but you're weak in reading, right? We don't say that. Instead, we say you've got some challenges to meet in this area, and look at all the success you've had in this area, right? Or similar language. All right. Here's some things to do. You probably noticed that I do a few of these in my own instruction. Support student self-regulation. Teach students strategies. Okay, so there are, this goes hand in hand with de-escalation. Yeah, because there are different things that we can teach students that help them to calm themselves down. Sometimes you've probably seen these things called stress balls. It's a squishy ball that people put in their hands and they can squeeze it. And you know, anyone who works in an office building has seen these things around, but if you're a kid, maybe you've never seen one. These can be, you know, provided. They're fairly inexpensive. It's the kind of thing that schools buy a lot of the time. That's just one example. Take a break. Breaks refresh students. Oh my gosh, you guys, when we're teaching on Zoom, when we're learning on you know, in this internet medium right here, you know, I think it's even more important than in a face-to-face classroom to take a break, because these machines that we use are wonderful, but they will give you a headache like nothing else. So I do like to get up from the computer, walk around the block for 5 minutes and come back as frequently as possible. Use self-calming tools. Okay, here's some more examples. Fidget toys, designating a place to take a break. That's not a punitive spot. Go to the corner, right? Not like that. Tracing your own hand. This can be calming. Counting, breathing, and other stuff. All right. We could also encourage collaboration, you know, physically in space, as physical distancing relaxes a little bit, as we hopefully are emerging from the pandemic phase of our reality. Students are going to be sitting close together once again. And this naturally leads to more collaboration. So we want to, dial that up and encourage that, because together everyone achieves more. And if you noticed that spells team, that's no accident. All right, inclusion and collaboration. What's the connection? Well, inclusion requires collaboration between teachers and students. All students need to learn how to work together. And in particular, we teach collaboration with individuals who are different and have different experiences. Okay. Yes, all of middle school, high school, and college is going to be about teaching our young learners how to work with other people, because everything that happens after that is about working with other people. And as the world gets smaller and smaller, and people get bigger and bigger in terms of population, that's going to be a more and more in-demand skill. So we need to start teaching that at a young age. What's a typical child? What's an average child? Have you ever met anyone who is normal? I haven't. Anyways, in the past, educators imagined that this existed. There's this typical child. Why can't you be like the typical child? Who is that? Is that someone we see on TV, or, who is that? Today, it's commonly accepted that all children learn differently and have unique needs and challenges. So this goes back to what I was saying previously about how one size does not fit all, right? Here's a men's large T-shirt that I'm wearing on St. Patrick's Day. It says Scotland on there. Okay, well, a men's large T-shirt in Japan is not a men's large T-shirt in California. Men's large T-shirt in Russia is not a men's large T-shirt in South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the literal meaning of one size fits all. But the figurative meaning is that one type of education does not work for every person. All right. Let's build upon strengths. Let's focus on building upon strengths. One of the foundational aspects of inclusion requires educators to build on student strengths. So this goes back to the asset model that we were speaking about before. Focus on areas of strength and assets first, rather than deficits, right? Oh, here's something that you're missing. We need to fill up this bucket with something because your bucket is empty. No. What about the other bucket that's already halfway full? Let's start looking at that one. With infinite time, we could learn about Ruby's inclusion story. Gosh, it is just really a good story. Let's see if we can. Let's be sure, even if we're not able to do this together at this time, let's be sure that we investigate Ruby's inclusion story. All right, let's talk a little bit about teachers and inclusion. All teacher prep programs in California require students to learn, that is to say student teachers, to learn about how best to support students with exceptionalities. This is, however, a fairly recent change in the requirements. We talked about, we have spoken about how not all of us are experts in providing SPED services. But what I'm stating here is simply that at least now credentialing programs include some formation in supporting students with exceptionalities. Different training centers in our area, like UC Davis, Sacramento State, Folsom Lake College, I recommend all three of these institutions have courses that provide opportunities for the application of content for classroom teachers. Okay, you all know by now that one of my favorite metaphors to use involves language. I'm a linguist by training. But what about culture? Culture and learning, there's a strong relationship between these two things. It's important to recognize that different cultures often view exceptionalities differently. Parents' experiences need to be valued and incorporated into shared decision-making for their children. So this, comes up a lot when the IEPs are being formulated. All right, so we're talking here about the relationship between cultural diversity and exceptionality. Cultural background has an impact on how families respond to an exceptionality. There are 4 culture impacts. The first, the value of independence versus family loyalty. This can, vary quite a bit, especially across continents. Second, the value of acculturation versus maintaining cultural identity. Again, we can go back to language for this one. It's a very good bellwether for this because you've probably noticed that some families who come to an English-speaking area, such as this one, tend to retain the language of the home more fully than other families. So the same thing can be said of culture. And third, responsibility of the siblings in childcare. How much are the brothers and sisters maybe taking care of the child who has an exceptionality? Fourth, family structure and dynamics need to be considered when we're writing up that IEP. All right. Language, linguistic diversity, and exceptionality. The language needs of a child can become confounded with learning challenges. In other words, it's challenge upon challenge. It can be difficult to disentangle potential language learning from learning disability. Okay. The phrase learning disability is not one that we use a lot anymore, but it's one that a lot of people understand. And what we're saying here is that it can be difficult to determine in a child who has been determined to be living with exceptionalities. It can be difficult to understand, as far as language development goes, what is coming from the exceptionality or exceptionalities and what is coming from the child's developing ability to negotiate a multilingual identity. So the problems become very complex, the challenges, I should say. It's important to always test children in their dominant or native language. This is one way that we can provide equity in standardized testing. And you've probably picked up by now on the fact that I'm not a huge fan of standardized testing because I don't see it as providing equity. I don't see it as being designed to be able to provide equity. But where possible, we can increase equity by making sure that a person's dominant language is one that they can be tested in. Other countries have figured this out. We here are still having quite a time with it. All materials regarding IEPs and assessments are required by law to be translated for families. And at IEP meetings, translators have to be provided. Not just at IEP meetings, but at other meetings. So, I know that right now there is a need for paraeducators, Farsi speaking and Spanish speaking in districts around the area. As a paraeducator, you probably won't be called upon to be the only translator unless a district translator is not available on that particular day. But it's always really, really helpful to have multilingual paraeducators. All right, let's take a break, step away from the computer, refresh our eyes here. Let's talk about the home-school connection. Supporting a student with an exceptionality often involves working with siblings, caregivers, grandparents, etc. The more communication between the teacher and the families, the better the outcomes are for the student. This goes for all students. Different families respond in different ways to learning that their child has a disability or a learning exceptionality, as we like to call them these days. These are some of the most common reactions. Denial. Oh no, not my child. Shock. Grief, mourning, being sad about it. Anger. This is a common one too. And depression. Depression usually comes in the sort of acceptance phase. Denial would be, one of the beginning phases. Acceptance would be one of the end phases, and depression might come then. So these are all possibilities. Teachers will interact with families at different points of their journey through special education. And families who've just recently learned of their child's diagnosis will need all kinds of information, access to resources, and reassurance. You could experience all those different things at once, and so the more support we can provide to families, the better. On the other hand, families who have been aware of their child's exceptionality for a longer period of time can have a history of frustration and anger, especially if they have not seen their child make progress or be treated fairly. They may see, the IEP meeting as something that's hostile or something that's going to encroach on their child's freedom or rights, or their rights as parents to determine how their child will be raised, stuff like that. Siblings can play an important role as well, brothers, sisters. Many families have multiple children in special education. Educators ought to see families as important partners. They will always be included in, things like the IEP meetings, and in helping to determine their children's future. Families want to know that teachers and paras are their child's advocates. We never want to put them in a position where they feel that they have to, they've got to get past us somehow, that we are a roadblock. Instead, we want to speak not for them, but speak with them. Frustration, anger, and disappointment need to be expressed and understood. Families want to know that teachers hear them and see them as experts on their child. In our post-test, we talked about how parents know more about their children than anyone else does. I think we all implicitly know that, but it's something that needs to be acknowledged by an agency, a school. So let's think about some common ways that teachers can adapt the environment for students with exceptionalities. When a family is going to have a baby, especially if it's the first baby, they have to sort of go around the house and start baby proofing the environment to make sure that there's nothing dangerous or nothing within reach that you don't want destroyed by the child. So there are sort of similar things that we need to do to prepare all classrooms, especially ones where we are serving folks who have exceptionalities. The learning environment. Common struggles arise for many students, not just those with exceptionalities. These are some of them. Emotion regulation. As we're growing and developing, this is a big one. Test anxiety. You guys, I have some adults. It's not just children. I have some adult students who get very anxious when it comes to tests. Social interactions, self-esteem issues. These things are connected, closely connected. Attention issues, organization and time management, executive functioning. Let's put a pin in executive functioning because this is connected to all sorts of exceptionalities. Executive function time. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Your experiences. At different times, we might all struggle with things like these. Starting a task, persisting, setting realistic goals, Inhibitory control, so controlling those impulses. Right now I'd like to go buy a bag of M&Ms and eat the whole thing, but I'm not going to do that. Attention, maintaining attention. These are all, somewhat related to one another, some more than others. But all of us tend to have trouble with these from time to time in our lives. Okay, let's talk about disproportionate representation. Culturally and linguistically diverse students are both over and underrepresented in special education. African American and Native American students are overrepresented in SPED services based on population. So this means that there's something wrong going on. There's nothing wrong with those populations. It's with their evaluation. On the converse, the flip side, Asian Americans and Hispanic students are underrepresented. Underrepresentation in gifted and talented programs, GATE programs, for African American and Hispanic and Latina students is also a thing. So that does not mean that people who belong to these groups, these communities, have anything that's actually different about them. It means that their evaluation has been inaccurate. Again, we go back to standardized testing and how it does not create equity in education. So why is this a big deal? Why is it an issue? There's lots of reasons. These are some of them. The identification of a disability that is causing a barrier to learning needs to be accurate and unbiased. Otherwise, folks are going to be placed in programs they don't need or not placed in programs they do need. This is only an issue in cases where identification is inaccurate, not where it's accurate, right? But it's also a problem if students are overlooked because of their racial identity. All right, what causes disproportionate representation? Lack of access to quality prenatal care. That's one thing. If records aren't, if things aren't being documented from the start, for instance, some exceptionalities can be detected in utero, not all, but some. Then you get a later start. And we know from everything we've learned in this course that early intervention is the key. Lack of access to quality childcare. This can be another one. What if it's just grandparents or auntie or someone taking care of the kids at home rather than daycare until they come to school? There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that those folks are probably not trained to detect exceptionalities. So again, it prevents us from the earliest detection, the earliest intervention. Higher levels of poverty are connected to both of these things, right? Anyhow, students from certain racial groups might be more likely to have an exceptionality because of lack of equity in access to all these. Okay, poverty is a lack of equity of access to funds, right? All right. Also, higher levels of stress. This can flow from poverty. It can flow from lack of quality childcare or exposure to trauma. These are, what's the word? In vitro, in utero. These are after birth. Okay, so not while the child is still getting ready to be born. Attending schools with fewer resources and teachers who have less experience. This is another way that people can be miscategorized and that exceptionalities can go undetected or over-detected, which are both bad. Okay, there are also some school-based causes, such as biased referrals, teacher or the school's perspective, may tend to track students from certain racial backgrounds into special education services. Accurate assessment test bias. This is the third time today I've talked about standardized tests not creating equity in education. Also, ineffective curriculum and instruction can be a thing, can be a factor. All right, gonna pause here. Okay, so how can we address disproportionate representation? Legislation, laws and policies in place to examine identification when disproportionate representation exists are needed. This is kind of the biggest one. It's the one that maybe we have the least control over, but when it's put to a vote, we can vote on it. Teacher preparation programs need to continue to boost up their curriculum on serving students with exceptionalities. And all of us working in schools, all of us stakeholders need to recognize the value of both linguistic and cultural diversity. If we continue to see someone's use of what you might call non-standard English as a negative or as a deficit, then we're going to mistakenly place folks into programs that they don't need to be placed in. And we'll continue to negatively score them on tests where they're not necessarily actually getting things wrong, but we're interpreting it that way. Our curriculum also needs to be culturally diverse and sustaining. And from this, the previous two flow. Let's do a little bit of review here. Inclusion has benefits for Gen Ed students as well as SPED students. And you folks have had a couple of different discussions about that on Canvas. Effective inclusion requires creating a positive classroom culture, including these things: collaboration with families, talked a lot about that, considering social emotional factors, the effects on families and on the students, providing supports for students like structure, clear expectations. This is helpful in de-escalation, remember. Consistency, student voice, making sure the students are involved in their IEP wherever possible, showing care and understanding. We want to also keep in mind that culture plays a role in how families and students respond to schooling and to being exceptional. Some common challenges for students like attention, emotion regulation, anxiety, self-esteem. These are tied to executive function. And we want to keep in mind the disproportionate representation of certain racial and cultural groups in our SPED and Gen Ed programs. All right, the last thing to do for this module is to complete the next practice test that'll prepare us for the district proficiency test. That's it for Module 7, Part 2 of our treatment of special education. Can't wait to see you folks for the next one.